Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. In this week, when we have as a country been riveted by the testimony of President Trump's former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, his testimony before Congress, we may be focused again on the president's tendency to tell falsehoods. You may want to think that this is an extraordinary time we're living in with a president widely believed to have a problem with the truth, but well, okay, it is an extraordinary time, but it's not the first time, certainly. And my guest on this episode, Sophia Rosenfeld, is the author of a new book, Truth and Democracy. Professor Rosenfeld of the University of Pennsylvania traces the history of untruth, of lying in our democracy, going back to the very beginnings of our country, and you'll be fascinated to learn that, sadly, the lack of truth in our politics has very deep roots, and something that we want to understand a whole lot better in order to put this current president into a proper perspective. Stay tuned for a really fascinating conversation with Professor Rosenfeld on this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. It has become something of a conventional wisdom today in the era of Trump that we are living in, or may soon be living in, a post-truth era where facts don't matter, where the media is fake news, where politicians, right on up to the president, wantonly misstate facts, misrepresent the truth, and perhaps even more concerning, as our guest today points out, people don't seem to care and accept that this is the state of our affairs today. And this has a great impact potentially on democracy, on our institutions, the Supreme Court, Congress, our view of the media, of institutions like universities and colleges. And so we have a very interesting conversation ahead of us as our guest today, Sophia Rosenfeld, will walk us through what to make of all of this. So first of all, Sophia, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Sophia is a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, right here in Philadelphia, and the author of a brand new book called Democracy and Truth, a short history, but a rich history and a fascinating history. So what is the answer to that, first of all, Sophia? And we'll get into this in some detail, but are we living in an era where truth truly is in the eye of the beholder?
Yeah, it's a terrific question, and it's a really hard one to answer. In some sense, of course, the answer is yes. We're suddenly in this strange world. Not that everybody was honest before, or that information wasn't combated, but we are in a moment in which there seems to be very little sort of shared sense of what constitutes reality, and maybe not even very many shared standards about how to get there, what institutions to trust, or what voices to trust, or even what methods to trust to arrive at anything like a kind of consensual truth. But whether we're all really sort of therefore have given up on truth, I'm not quite so sure. I would say we're, in the middle of a battle insofar as say the president lies on a frequent basis, but there's been an awful lot of pushback too, and it's come from citizens, it's come from courts, it's come from the press, it's come from experts of various kinds. So I don't think we've sort of plunged 100% into the world of post-truth, but there is something of a battle going on over what truth is going to look like in the future and how much it will or won't matter in American public life.
Well, and we had a somewhat similar conversation on this program a few weeks ago with the author of a book from the University of Chicago Law School. His focus was the state of our constitutional democracy, and are we witnessing, the perhaps not so slow circling of the drain with the assault on our very institutions. And there is that perspective, but then there's also the perspective that maybe we're witnessing something of, as you say, a pushing back on that, and perhaps even a reawakening of great interest in our political process. not only in elections, but in the setting of policy, young people on up to older citizens. And so, there are a number of ways looking at that. And I think you could say that about what we're going to talk about today as well. But maybe you
Hmm.
could start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write this book. Really great book, by the way. I've been reading it and enjoying it very, very much.
Well,
How did you come to write Democracy and Truth?
Well, first of all, thanks. Thanks. I'm delighted to hear that you've been finding it interesting. I came to writing this book both as a historian, I think, and as a citizen. Like everybody else, after the last presidential election, I found myself slightly obsessed on the political front, and like many people, checked my phone a few too many times a day to see what was new and what had happened. I
Hmm.
think we've all been sort of obsessed with the political, not just the big questions, but sort of the hour to hour shifts in
Hmm.
the political culture in which we live. And I was having a hard time, in a sense, refocusing my attention on earlier moments because I was so obsessed with the present. But I also started to recognize that some of the discourse around contemporary politics was only sort of placing what had happened in the perspective of the last few years, that there wasn't much thinking about how do you situate the sort of surprise of the Trump victory, but also the sort of shifts in our politics more broadly in the last decade or so in a larger framework. And I'd spent a long time as a historian thinking about sort of the underlying conditions of democracy and how they emerged. And I specialize actually in the age of revolution. So I've been thinking
Hmm.
about this in terms of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution and how we get the political culture that we, in a sense, still live in, a democratic one. And all this reading about what it was going on right now made me sort of reflect on the fact that there wasn't much out there that tried to link the world we're living in now with the past, and to really try to assess what was novel about it and what wasn't. And the answer was, of course, some things are distinct to our moment, and some things are sort of rooted in the longer history of democracy in a way, whether we're talking about, you mentioned another professor at Chicago Law School writing about sort of constitutionality, or whether you're talking about my work on the culture of truth and lies. All of these things have a long backstory. So
Hmm.
I guess to solve my obsessions, I kind of went back and tried to place the present in a long genealogy and drew on some of my earlier work, which had focused on things like the role of common sense in politics.
Well, so maybe we could use that as a framework for how we work through some of this, which is
Hmm.
when we appreciate the historical perspective, and you do spend a lot of time tracing some of the origins of our democratic institutions and our uh, attitudes and approach and control over and access to information and truth from the Enlightenment right through to the present. Um, we can maybe think about what is different about today and what isn't different
Hmm.
about today. And I was maybe to start on that, I was really struck by this quote. Um, I'll leave out the author till the end because I think that's the point. You quote a president, a former president, is saying, is really criticizing the news media of his time as having quote, teemed with all the invective that disappointment, ignorance of facts, and malicious falsehoods could invent to misrepresent my politics and affections, to wound my reputation and feelings, and to weaken, if not entirely destroy, the confidence that you, the public, have been pleased to repose in me. Now, if not for the word repose, I think that those words could have come out of the mouths of our current president. But actually, that was a quote from our first president in 1796 at the end of his presidency, George Washington, criticizing the news media.
Yes, it's a wonderful quote, isn't it? I mean, it's of course he's extremely eloquent by our standards because his use of English is really beautiful, but the sentiments, as you point out, are really identical, right? It's a president basically saying, most of the news media is false and all they do is attack me, and the whole idea of even objective news. is a relatively recent idea. It's not really till the late 19th century that the New York Times promises to provide you something new, which is facts and objective reporting. Newspapers are highly partisan in the early days. They're important, but they sway public opinion, but they're just as partisan as what we think of as partisan media now. And so many of the conditions around democracy were never sort of pure in any way. Presidents lied from the beginning. The press offered just what Washington called invective and lies of various kinds, and politicians pushed back, and people wrung their hands about immorality and a culture of misrepresentation. And so some of this is very old. And also, I think most importantly, what's really old is a conflict between expert opinion on the one hand and sort of popular sentiment on the other. And those two things often not in accord. So some of those strains are really central to democracy. And that's because the really key characteristic of democracies from the 18th century onwards is both a commitment to the idea of truth, but also an unwillingness, probably quite rightly so, to give any one person or institution the authority to define what counts as truth. So truth is by definition contested.
Right. Well, that's where I think we have to go back into our history on that point, and it may seem incongruous to suggest that we have to go back to the Age of Enlightenment to understand Donald Trump and the time we live in. But as you trace it in your book, you do have to. And if you start there, if you start in the late 18th century, you're coming out of a time when there were individuals or institutions that had a grip on the truth or what passed as the truth. You had the church, you had monarchs, kings and queens, you had authoritarian leaders of regions, not just countries. And then you come to the Age of Enlightenment and pick up there, if you would, and because we have to trace this idea that, as you say, there are experts, and I don't think you only mean individual experts, but experts in knowledge and ideas and facts versus the public.
Right. So one of the great innovations of the Enlightenment, and it's of course at the roots of our First Amendment, is the idea that the best way to get to truth, and this is even in John Milton, a century before the American Revolution, is that the way to get there would be to let people hash it out in some kind of public sphere. That deregulating the world of ideas, in other words, no longer giving the church the authority to say this is what is orthodox or this is what is true, and no longer giving a monarch, when it came to political matters, the authority to say this is official dogma or this is what is truth, would actually lead to a better grasp of truth. If people could argue in a public way as individuals and even with the backing of different institutions, something like real truth would eventually emerge, but a kind of publicly arrived at truth. And that's really the basic idea behind, I think, most of the attachment of democracies to the idea of free speech. Not just that it's a form of freedom, but that it'll take you closer to some kind of real knowledge in the end. And that has genius qualities, but it leads to a lot of fighting.
Well, not only the freedom to speak, but the freedom to have multiple, perhaps limitless ideas compete. I remember the phrase "the marketplace of ideas," which is something our Supreme Court has used when talking about cases involving free speech. But back in the late 1700s. And I think this is also important to remember as we come to the modern era, when we have things like social media and the internet, defining who has access to information, not necessarily facts, but information. In the late 1700s, this idea of allowing ideas to flourish in competition, that wasn't meant to suggest that everybody would have the same freedom, right?
Right. Right.
So
So
we
the
had,
other, so absolutely. So the other
yeah.
important aspect of democracy from the beginning is that it's always been built on various kinds of exclusions too. That early public sphere that Enlightenment leaders imagine wasn't going to involve Black people. It wasn't going to involve women. It wasn't going to involve um, religious minorities in some cases. It was definitely imagined initially as a kind of restrictive public sphere. And over time, of course, that sphere has expanded. More voices have been brought in. But at the same time, there are good arguments that a kind of technocratic ethos and the growth of expertise has also done a lot to drown out those popular voices at the same time, creating different kinds of battles. So there's been fighting over what constitutes truth from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
What you said, though, about the marketplace of ideas is really interesting because, of course, that's a 20th century idea, but it draws on Mill and Milton and others who came before. And there are good questions now whether that metaphor is really apt or not for our world. Is the internet a kind of perfect marketplace of ideas, as some of its early sponsors thought, or is it quite the opposite, a place in which there's no incentive for truth to prevail, what sensational prevails, where there's too much distraction, where it's impossible for people to weigh all the goods available in the marketplace, that people therefore just sort of silo themselves off and read what they already know, whether actually it functions effectively like a marketplace that would lead to truth, or that's an obsolete idea for our times. And I think that's a really actually important conversation.
Well, and we're starting to have that conversation now with questions about whether those who control these major marketplaces, these major platforms like Facebook and Twitter and all, whether they have some obligation to censor
Mm-hmm.
things that are demonstrably false. And
Yeah.
that gets at the central question you're raising in your book, which is, what is fact? What is truth? How do we
Right.
even know?
Right. And one of the interesting things about First Amendment jurisprudence, for instance, is that it's not really designed to deal with matters of truth and falsehood much. Most of it's about protecting opinions. There's not much about is there an obligation for truth to prevail in some way? And this conversation is pretty new in some ways about, do these media companies, which are all obviously for profit, have some obligation to the public to try to weed out what's completely false, or is this just an open market and anything, anybody can pose as anyone, and misinformation is as good as information? And I don't think we've really concluded what to do. In some sense, the technology, it seems to me, has gotten ahead of the law.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you talk about this, the way in which conspiracy theories can flourish in an internet age, in the age of social media, even deliberate attempts to undermine truth. We know Russian bots that
Mm-hmm.
had influence in our election and continue to uh, be caught, purveying, actual falsehoods, through outright um, lying about who they even are, and just the propensity, because we have social media, and where are people getting their information? People don't read newspapers as much. They don't watch Walter Cronkite, of course, anymore.
Yeah.
They're getting their news from Twitter, and
Mm-hmm.
so what does that mean? And when we start with concerns in the Enlightenment age with giving, kind of the ragged public, people who don't even know that they're ignorant, don't even
Mm-hmm.
know their condition, as some of the leading luminaries of the time talked about them. And today we have the complete opposite. We have limitless access to information, and there's a terrible, uh, not even likelihood, it's certainty that can
Mm-hmm.
be corrupted now.
Right. Yes, it's absolutely the case that in some ways old politics based in rumor and conspiracy are back. And
Mm.
instead of being destroyed by new media, they're encouraged by new media, and they get repeated at the highest levels. And even things like fact checking, which, say, the Washington Post and the New York Times have been very good at doing in the last few years. One, they don't persuade about a third of the population, who see them as simply more spin, see all facts as political in some way. But two, because they spread via social media, things like Twitter, even debunking a conspiracy can help propel the conspiracy, because
Hmm.
the more you say that Pizzagate didn't happen or there is no caravan, say, you're already pushing those words and those expressions to the front of the line in political consciousness. And people don't remember which part of it was true or not, but the notion sticks, even the language sticks. And so sometimes even fact checking can end up helping spur conspiracy theories and spread them wider. So it's a dilemma that's sort of structural, and I think it's a dilemma that will increasingly pollute in some ways our political environment until we can think of some way to combat it, which may require the law, which may require real changes in the media landscape, and may require changes in education as well.
Well, and you know, you cite the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, which is fairly recent, but
Mm-hmm.
there have been conspiracy theories for a long time on even weightier topics, ones that, I think of even greater consequence, like Holocaust denial. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it just seems, and I'm before becoming a lawyer, was a scholar on the Holocaust, and it's just amazing to even imagine that there could be those who could think to deny that the Holocaust happened, but they are, and in an internet age, that can get some traction, or climate science denial
Yeah,
today,
yeah.
that we're dealing with today. So these have a great impact on the way our democracy functions, on the way we think about policy. Maybe if you take it to its extreme, on the survival of the planet, if we don't
Right.
if
No,
we
that's
don't
absolutely
take
true.
action on the issue of climate change. So uh, what are some of the historical roots of that? Even though the internet, in terms of history, is fairly recent, but what are some of the historical roots of that, and how does that help us understand? Do you think the times we're in right now?
Yes, certainly, because as you point out, rumor and conspiracy are not new, and they're not particular to any part of the globe. They run through every political culture, and not surprisingly, because most of the time the reason they exist is because people don't have full information, and quite rightly, they are often skeptical too about the truths that they're being fed from above, which leads people to try to imagine alternative scenarios, real explanations that underlie what seem to be the official version of things. What's probably unusual right now, as you point out, Holocaust denial, for instance, has been going on a long time, but we're seeing more of it in the mainstream, that it's percolating upward rather than staying at the margins.
Hmm.
The same with the sort of challenge to science. There have always been challenges to what counts as official science, particularly now around climate change. But what's surprising is how much it seems to have captured a large part of both the political class and the general public. I don't think the answer, though, is for simply a kind of top-down response where, um, you know, kind of overeducated people just tell everybody else what to think.
Hmm.
There is, when democracy functions properly, I think there is a kind of dialogue between people with expertise, say climate scientists, and a general public, until there's a kind of some sort of loose consensus about at least what the facts are. Then there can be a debate about values, about what to do. But if you can't agree whether the planet is getting warmer or colder, it's very hard to then move to the level of policy debate. And I think that's where the real risk lies, that we can't agree on some basic facts. It becomes hard to have um, real political debate that is the kind of core heart of democracy.
Well, I wonder, you made the point earlier about the press. There's nothing new about claims that the press is partisan or biased, is more common term. Um, yeah, there was a time when you didn't read a newspaper to get the news. You read a partisan newspaper. If you were a
Yes.
Democrat, or you read the Democratic newspaper in your town, and if you were Republican, you read the Republican-leaning newspaper in your town. And certainly the news media was influenced by money, advertisements, politics, the political leanings of the publisher. Those kinds of things have existed long before the era of Trump, and that's true of what we understand to be truth more generally. I'm looking at climate science, for instance. Is it really a debate about science, or is it a debate about politics? If you're somebody who doesn't accept the science, even though the science is overwhelming, is that because you tend to get money from the energy companies and the energy lobby? Is it influenced by that more than what truth itself is, or what science itself says in some objective sense?
Yes, and the money question is, of course, important because there's money behind every position. When there's money, much of it federal money, behind a lot of climate science, NIH, and and all sorts of funding that has helped create the world of climate science, but there's also money behind climate science denial. It's not simply a sort of populist reaction from below. It's been also stirred by, say, the Koch brothers foundations that have pushed a line against climate science. So and this comes to politics too. And I think sometimes the public is quite rightly skeptical that what's issued as a think tank opinion on something often turns out to be highly partisan, backed by money that is attached to either industrial concerns or an industry or a lobbying group. So some skepticism is healthy. I think what's not so healthy is the idea that there can be no realm of consensual truth, that everything is a form of spin, that no one can be trusted, because frankly, we can't know everything, and we have to have a certain trust level. When you go to a doctor, you have to assume that the doctor has a kind of expertise that you don't have. If you don't trust at all that expertise, it leads you to kind of question the validity of any medical interventions, and that's dangerous. So one doesn't want to give sort of everything to experts, but on the other hand, you don't want to dismiss experts in every capacity, because we can't know, I can't know sitting at my desk in Philadelphia if the planet is warming. I have to be able to trust the overall scientific consensus, and I do. The problem is that some of those lines of trust have worn so far away, and even trust in fellow citizens, that many of us have come to believe that all we're left with is opinions or feelings, and that we never can get to anything objective.
Well, my mind is going in so many directions at once here, but is that new? Because certainly that's something that you do hear today with where we are today, and the president. I mean, Donald Trump refers to the media as fake news if it's not an article that he doesn't like. But the next day, if the New York Times comes out with an article he does like, all of a sudden that's not fake news. So, but the fake news is used to attack the credibility of this institution, and there have been times when he has attacked the credibility of the institution of our federal courts, of science generally. When we talk about climate science, he called it a hoax. That's not saying I disagree. That's calling it that's to try to throw it entirely out the window and tell people don't believe any part of that. It's a hoax. So what is that something different or new in the way truth is challenged or talked about, or is that also something that you see as having some roots in history that may help us appreciate the perspective a bit?
Yeah, I think it's an exaggeration of something that's old. I mean, I think their presidents have always on the one hand, lied in the moral sense, which is
Mm-hmm.
sometimes stretched the truth or exaggerated or misstated things to encourage a particular response in the public. And they've always also traded in unsubstantiated beliefs when it's in their interests, which is to say to pass along kind of erroneous information, which is a little different than the sort of ordinary lie. So we shouldn't begin from the premise that, Honest Abe or something like that is the gold standard and this is the first deviation. On the other hand, I do think both the frequency and the nature of the lying emanating from the very top of the government, which is to say the presidency right now, is fairly unprecedented. Because what's interesting about Trump is not just that he lies to cover up self-dealing or illegality, which is pretty standard practice. He also lies for a variety of other reasons, I think. There's the kind of Roger Stone position that it spreads chaos. Nobody kind of knows what to believe anymore. You sort of suggest, nobody really knows what's true. It doesn't really matter. One day it's true, one day it's not. But what matters is winning. There's the kind of anti-authority position, the sort of thumbing your nose at even researchers within your own government. When he denounces, that the Congressional Budget Office doesn't know what it's talking about, that's unusual for a president. Or that the CIA has things wrong, that's unusual
To just
too.
disrupt for the sake of disrupting,
right?
Really.
And
Yeah.
It's a way to display power, and it's a way to thumb your nose at the sort of expert classes, and it's a way to sow a certain amount of kind of uncertainty in everyone. One day he says this is true, one day he says it's not true. The numbers change, whatever he's referring to. It's a tactic that's not unique to Trump. There are other leaders have used this. Some people see it as a kind of authoritarian technique even. But it's different from the standard lying, which is the lying where you try to cover up something because it's embarrassing or will reflect badly on your presidency or even cover up illegality.
Well, it does seem like to me like it is a throwback because, of course, in the pre-Enlightenment era, truth was reserved to, kings and the church and to authoritarians. And we saw that in the 20th century where the truth was whatever the king or the dictator said the truth was. And I'm not prone to, calling up images of brown shirts when thinking about this president, but there is a certain quality in which he does throw every institution out, and in terms of how we should regard it and its credibility, and say, I know, I know
exactly.
about this. I know more about this subject than anybody else, even if it's something that to look at him you'd say, well, how would you even know the first thing about that? But he seems to disrupt all of the institutions around him, leaving only himself as the one who knows the most about whatever the subject is.
That's true. One of his favorite expressions is "trust me," and then he goes on, "Trust me, I've been hearing blah 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 blah," which is to suggest that truth does emanate from him, and that is a kind of move that's generally associated with either kings or some kind of despots to say, "I know better. I'll just tell it, and I don't have to cite where I got my information." He sometimes says he operates on hunches. He doesn't need to read briefings because he'll just know if he can trust the leader of North Korea or not from his gut. Or he'll say, look, I've been hearing lots of different things, but trust me, I know such and such. No one knows more about it than me.
But again,
most of that is kind of rhetorical. I don't think he's actually dismantled all of the institutions of democracy in the U.S. And whether he's even really trying to, I'm not even sure. But as a rhetorical strategy, I think you're right. These are the expressions that are often associated with authoritarianism.
But again, he's not the first, and I think that is something that having a historic appreciation for history should help us with. George W. Bush famously said, "I looked Putin in." I think it was George W. said, "I looked Putin in the eye, and I saw." Other presidents have said, "I know." I know George W. Bush was criticized on Saturday Night Live or lampooned on Saturday Night Live for operating from his gut. My gut tells me what to do. So Trump isn't the first.
Absolutely not.
To use these, as you say, these rhetorical tools.
And some of it's a kind of folksy American political style, which isn't necessarily all bad either, which starts
Yeah.
from the premise that, look, I'm at the heart of things. Obama did it too, used the evoked common sense to say, in some ways I'm just a regular guy. It's obvious to me that this is the case, the same way it's obvious to anybody sitting at their kitchen table this morning. If you want to save some money, you don't spend as much. That's just common sense, right? And
Yeah.
that would be a sort of folksy way to convey you're a regular person.
Or
And
Bill
so
Clinton saying, "I feel your
Clinton did
pain."
it too. Yeah. So
Yeah.
so they turn to expertise when they want to, and they turn to sort of folksy gut impressions when they want to as well. And after all, politics is, a lot of it is about rhetoric and persuasion. So it's not surprising that politicians call up a variety of different modes to try to win over support. I mean, they're in the business of persuasion. So some of this is deeply rooted, and there are many ways in which Trump is conventional. That said, the degree of his lying and his seeming sort of not efforts to just simply lie, but simply dismiss the idea that truth really matters, that it doesn't matter if there are more people crossing the border this year or last year or 10 years ago, that's a sort of irrelevant piece of information. If he says there's an emergency, there's an emergency. That is rather new to democratic discourse, at least in the U.S.
Well, and again, is he a populist? And if so, the idea of populism isn't anything new. You talk about this in your book too. The language itself is a means to conveying a kind of truth. And so if President Trump is thumbing his nose at elites, and he certainly isn't the first Republican president to use that rhetorical device, Northeastern liberals or the elites on university campuses like the University of Pennsylvania,
Yes.
the language he uses in doing that it has its own persuasive appeal. And maybe even you look at Trump and the way he talks and the way he seems to disregard what others would call facts or truth, and there are those who find an appeal in that and say he's a straight talker. He's
Right,
actually,
right.
He's more truth than the truth.
Absolutely. So that's the interesting thing, is you can objectively look at him and say, yes, he adopts in sometimes a recognizable populist idiom that's at different times been used on the right and on the left, most recently more often on the right, and not that surprising, although you wonder why people don't see through it insofar as if he's denouncing, East Coast elites. He's a very wealthy man from birth, born in New York City, who attended himself the University of Pennsylvania.
Right.
I mean, he's hardly a man of the people in the conventional sense in his tastes or anything else. So there's a kind of sort of phoniness built into his populism from the beginning, but that's true of many political leaders. So that's not so unusual. But as you say, he's been able to simultaneously lie constantly and seem to some people as authentic, who read him as authentic not because he tells the truth, but he tells what people are really thinking. So when he says, Mexicans who come to the United States are majority rapists, no one really thinks that's an accurate representation of the population of Mexicans in the U.S. However, he's sort of saying what you weren't supposed to say. And he's saying what's not politically correct and what's taboo. And in that sense, he's telling it like it is. He's telling it the way people would speak if they didn't have cameras around, but he's doing it with cameras, directed right at him. So it lends him, supposedly, for many people, a kind of aura of authenticity, even as he's kind of deeply dishonest and also not the populist he makes himself out to be.
Well, so telling people what they want to hear or what they want to think, whether it's based in actual fact or actual science or actual truth, again, that's something that may characterize, or what we think characterizes this president, but it's nothing new. And in your book, you're looking not only at the historical roots in our own country
Hmm.
from the founding, from the Revolutionary era forward, but also those that we're very close to in France and England. And I'm wondering, when I think about other moments in history that sort of illustrate this, one that's coming to mind as we're talking is the debate over evolution.
Yes.
You know, on the one hand, how can you deny evolution as a scientific truth? But there are currents running through our country and its politics and its social fabric, maybe, that are somewhat different from other countries like ours, France and England, let's say, because it seems like the opposition uh, to the idea, the scientific idea of evolution as an explanation for how we got where we are, is religiously motivated.
Hmm.
And of course, the whole idea of the Enlightenment was to leave behind the idea of faith and move to rules and truths based on things that were actually knowable. But yet, in our country's history, and I think we still see this a lot today, there is still a great influence of religious belief that guides what we believe the truth actually is, and perhaps even how we can disregard things that many other people would say is absolutely proven scientific fact.
Yeah. No, that's a
Is that,
very important point. I mean,
yeah.
you're absolutely right that in some ways is distinguishing feature of American politics, though the similar kinds of struggles between experts and populist voices are have been and are currently going on elsewhere in the world. But I think you're entirely right that this isn't just a dispute about who gets to say what's true. In other words, which sector of the
Hmm.
population. It's also what you might call about epistemology, which is to say, how do we know what's true?
Right,
And
right.
different social groups have attached themselves to different ways of knowing, you might say. And the way of knowing associated with experts has increasingly been related to sort of a scientific method in different forms, even when it's about social phenomena, ways of measuring and forms of experimentation and proof and evidence. And of course, courts are part of this too, the law too, have sort of provided us with models of certain ways of knowing. But there's a large part of the population is also attached to other ways of knowing that look a lot less like what you study in law schools or PhD programs in science or economics departments. And that often begins with the idea that some things are best known either through reading great texts, the Bible, for instance, or
Hmm.
through faith, or through instinct, or even just through experience, experiential living. You know, that if you go outside and it's cold and it's snowing, that's pretty irrefutable proof that the planet isn't getting as warm as all that. So those are sort of set themselves in some ways often in opposition to more expert ways of knowing. Most of us combine a little of all of those things at different
Yeah.
moments, but we all rely on experiential knowledge. You don't stick your hand in a fire because you know you're going to get burned if you do. So, and a little bit of faith in things you simply believe, and a little bit of expertise. But when they set themselves up as sort of walled-off groups, you get real conflict over truth. So, and I think that you're absolutely right that one of the distinguishing features of American political life is that there is a large block of religious voters, mainly evangelical Christians, who have been attached to the idea that, for instance, the presidency of Trump is God's plan for the U.S., and that's not something that's demonstrable, but something that can be known on faith, and
Mm.
therefore is essentially hard to argue against with what most experts would take to be evidence, because it doesn't depend on ordinary forms of evidence. On the other hand, there are conflicts like this elsewhere in the world, in places including in Europe, over populist and elite truth that don't rely quite as heavily on a religious voter base.
Right, the current of r- religious faith and belief, and the connections between that to b- what political position you might take, or even what scientific position you might take. I mean,
Hmm.
I just certainly don't mean that in any necessarily negative way, because as you say, we all, to varying degrees, combine uh, varying kinds of faith, whether it's religious, spiritual, or something else, with reason. We're all.
Yes,
I don't think very few of us are purely reason or purely faith. We're some
absolutely.
combination of those things. But there's a different kind of faith, in a sense, that you talk about, and that others have talked about. You call it, and I'm going to ask you to explain this term, tribal epistemology.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, is a kind of hyper partisanship today
Yeah.
that impacts how we understand what is truth.
Yeah, it's a wonderful expression. And it's not actually mine. It first appeared in a series of articles in Vox, which is a pretty good journal
Hmm.
on these things. But it's a wonderful expression because they're two words that don't sound like they're going to go together: tribal
Right.
and epistemology.
Yeah.
And I think the point is to say that it's not so much that there are a plurality of different methods for arriving at knowledge or truth out there. It's that different groups have attached themselves to one or the other, and they kind of root for their tribal. Sounds like the same thing, the way you might describe Eagles fans and Patriots fans.
Hmm.
The sort of two teams on, and that
Right.
now even epistemology has a team spirit attached to it, so
Right.
that when you're saying the New York Times cites this piece of information, that's not a neutral stance. That's siding with the liberal establishment that establishes news in the following fashion. That's a partisan stand to even cite an article in the New York Times. And the
Well,
president is
yeah.
not helped by, every time he calls the mainstream news media fake news, he's helping destabilize the idea that there's any place we can all turn that might be neutral for legitimate information.
Right. He does play that game. There's my team. You're either on my team or you're on
Yeah,
the other team. And the so-called mainstream news media, the Washington Post, New York Times, they're on the other team. They may sometimes, fumble, let's say, to carry
right.
through the metaphor. But most of the time they're on the other team. And
Yeah,
that's the tribal nature of it, and epistemology, how we know what we know. Well, if you're on my team, we know because my team said so.
right. And as you point out with your Darwin and evolution reference, this isn't really new. It's not like there was a shared neutral epistemology in the 19th century. But the hyper-partisanship we're seeing right now has meant that it's extended down to how do you know anything? Where do you get your information? What do you believe? Who can you trust? To a degree that seems a little surprising to people who, for instance, you mentioned earlier Walter Cronkite, who once upon a time probably would have largely agreed that what you saw in one of the major network news accounts at 6 o'clock was a pretty accurate account of what had happened. Now, you might disagree about what should come next, and certainly
Hmm.
politics has always been a combative sport, but you might have simply agreed that it was a pretty good reflection of what had happened, a kind of factual truth. Now it's not even clear that we have found some source that we can collectively turn to and say, that's even what happened, simply an account of the day's events.
Well, and I don't know if we have enough time to go too deeply into this next thought I'm having, but just throw it out there a little bit and see what you think. Again, I'm reluctant to place too much stock in President Trump as the author of all that is today, because as we've already talked about, a lot of the things that we're seeing play out today may be more or less, but nonetheless of things similar to what we've seen throughout our country's
Mm-hmm.
history. Um, but in in thinking about this idea that the institutions of truth are more and more suspect today, and therefore, we can even think to ask the question, "What is truth?" anymore. Um, from just to go back to the period that you start with in your book, the Enlightenment, to move from the idea of faith as a basis of knowledge and truth to science as a source for knowledge and truth. I mean, you think about science in the 1800s, it didn't look anything like science today in terms of what we
Right.
could know, but at least you could say there seemed to be a steady march forward in understanding, whether it's understanding how the human body works down to the cellular level, or understanding how the universe was created, to go to the other extreme. But yet you can also look at science, maybe in the last century, as itself going through its own kind of crisis. Because I mean, look at our understanding of food and nutrition and dieting.
Hmm.
I mean, you can turn on Netflix and see a documentary touting every imaginable, uh, truth in terms of what
Yeah.
is the pathway to health through nutrition that you can imagine. So even in the world of science, it seems, with the proliferation of information, with the proliferation of knowledge, in a way, truth itself is called into question. Ironically, but
Yes.
nonetheless, seems
Yes.
like that's so.
Right. I mean, you could say the Enlightenment gave a lot of credence to truth by imagining there'd be progress towards greater truths. Most earlier eras suggested that truth was what had already been known in the ancient world, for instance, and our job was simply to recover it. But
Hmm.
the Enlightenment suggested, as did the scientific revolution really, that truth was sort of a horizon in front of us, that we'd get closer all the time, but we would never get entirely there. We'd
No.
have to, but there could be progress in what humans can know. And in many ways, that is proven true. We know things that people in the 18th century didn't know. But along the way, there have also been a lot of steps that have taken us in the wrong direction, things like totally discredited race sciences in the
Yeah.
19th and 20th centuries that
Mm.
now are thought to be, a form of propaganda, but that were taken to be science in their moment. And so science is full of errors, and it's full of conflicted opinions, as you point out, about something like nutrition. And so we've come to, in a sense, both put more premium on truth-telling and on knowledge, and are less and less sure where it comes from or what really can be trusted. And it's healthy for us to all be collectively and individually, I think, skeptics to a certain degree, to not believe everything we read, even from authoritative sources. But total skepticism takes you into the land of conspiracy theory, which is to say nothing is as it seems. And it's a kind of reductio ad absurdum position, right, where you
Hmm.
say everything I've been told is a form of lie,
Yeah.
as opposed
Chaos.
to the best knowledge we have in imperfect circumstances with imperfect brains.
Right. Or as you said earlier, a state of chaos. And that's very unsettling to think that that's where we are.
Right.
But so I don't want to end on that note. Is there
No, because
something
I mean,
positive you can say?
courts have the same problem, right? They often cannot determine truth with 100% certainty.
No.
However, they also don't give up and say, therefore, that no one can know anything about anything. There has to be some standard for what constitutes enough conviction that we're closest to truth as we're going to be able to get.
So what do we do? What do we historians and citizens and information and truth seekers, what do we do? What do we
Yeah,
do in
that's
this
of
time
course
we
the
live in?
really hard question, and historians don't have necessarily any better answers than anybody else. Um, but I do think there are. I think if we want to, I think it's important first of all that truth be at least the horizon. If we don't always get there, it's important both for practical reasons, the building of policies that are sound, and for sort of aspirational purposes that we keep imagining truth as at least a goal. So I'm not inclined to say we give up on it at all. But how do you get to a state in which there's even some consensual truth and some standards around truth that we can collectively agree on is a hard one. At the smallest level, I think we do small things that the press, for instance, has been doing, continue to fact check, continue to
Hmm.
report as accurately as possible on the world. At the next level, we probably try to strengthen some of our institutions that are important for conveying and disseminating truth, whether that's the press, the machinery of elections, the court systems, universities, all the institutions that are vital to helping us determine truth from falsehood and methods for getting there. And probably at some level we'll have to rethink the kind of very wide cultural, economic, educational disparities that govern our society today. That's obviously the hardest part to tackle, but maybe the most important, insofar as one reason, I think, that we are in a state in which people see the world so differently from different vantage points is not just because we consume social media, but because we already live to a certain degree in isolated worlds economically, educationally, culturally. And until something is done to kind of address that growing disparity between elites and everyone else, it's hard to imagine that there'll be enough kind of common ground that people could watch the same evening news program and see the world in like enough terms that it could at least be a starting point for a real political conversation. So those are sort of from the micro to the macro. I don't think there are any easy fixes, but I think we ignore the problem at our peril.
Well, and I'm going to throw out one last thing as we wrap up today, which is, and you really launched chapter 2 of your book on this note, and that's to quote Immanuel Kant, great 18th century thinker, who said, "Dare to know." So I think we have to dare to know. And
I love that quote
means.
too.
Yeah,
yes, that is. I mean, it's wonderful. It's a kind of call to arms. It says, stop just accepting things. Dare to go find out what's going on out in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Sophia Rosenfeld, the University of Pennsylvania historian and author of the new book, which I highly recommend and have very much enjoyed reading, Democracy and Truth, A Short History, now available, and encourage everybody to get it. It's a great read. It's not a long read and a very enjoyable read. So,
well,
Sophia,
thank you so much.
Thank you
very much. That was a very interesting conversation.
Great. I really enjoyed it too. Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.